In this tutorial we're going to show you how to load data into Datascape and create your first 3D visualization. I've started off with an empty workspace and I can look all around it, and on the left hand side I have the main menu and the command panels. So the first thing I want to do is bring in my data, so I go to add new data set. We've got various ways of bringing data into the system. For now I'm just going to use the file reader, and that then asks me to find the file on my PC. I'm going to bring in some data about admissions into Birmingham schools, and it's in the Excel format. So this is the data preview screen, so I can see the first few rows of the data set, and for each field I can set the type. If you're not sure what's what, then quite honestly you can just click a button here that says treat everything as text. It still goes into Datascape and you can actually still plot it all as numbers. Also, if there are particular fields I'm not going to use, so for instance these ones on appeals I'm not interested in at the moment, I can deselect those, and then once I've chosen what I want to import, I just click on import, and it tells me here that it's imported 76 lines of data. Click on next. The next thing is to set up my mapping. What it's done here is actually looked at that data set and then looked at existing mappings in the system and told me which ones might be a close match. You can see here's one I did earlier, but in this case I'm going to do this from scratch. So I click on new, and then I get an option of a couple of different mapping templates, and we'll be gradually adding to these so as to do things like spheres and cylinders. But for now I'm just going to use manual mapping. And this is the main mapping editor, and this is probably the most important screen in the whole of Datascape, because this is where I take the fields in my data and I map them across to the different attributes of the points that I'm going to plot. And we can just do this by simple drag and drop, so I can pick up the row ID, so I've got an ID for that particular point. For X, what we're going to do is we're going to choose the distance that the last child was admitted, so I'm going to drag that across. And then for Z, I'm going to put in the popularity. And it's a good idea first time you bring in your data just to set the y-axis to 0, so actually you just bring it in as 2D. Then once you're happy it looks about right, you can then introduce a 3D element. I'm just going to change the size down, make that a little bit smaller. And you'll notice here it's set to auto scale, so this means it'll automatically set the axes to the correct values when I bring the data in. So if I click on plot, there we see my data. I just click the mouse button so as to move into navigation mode, and I can see the data. You'll notice a lot of points are set along the z-axis. That's because they have no distance of last child, because they're the selective schools, and we'll see that in a moment. So if I go back to the edit mode just by left clicking on the mouse, and I can go back to my mapping. To create the third dimension, we're going to take the number of people who had this school as a first preference, and we're going to drop that into Y. Also, just to make the data a bit easier to read, we're going to pick up the school name and add that into the system as a label, and click on plot. And you see now my data has been spread up the vertical axis. And what I can also do now is I hover over each of these individual points, I can see what the school is. What we're now going to do is change the size, so instead of having a fixed value of 0.3, I'm going to take the total number of people that entered the school, and I can use a little preview eye here to see what the range of the data is. So I can see this ranges from 31 to 314. Now my axes in world units are currently set to 10 by 10, so I need to make this quite a bit lower. So what we could do is maybe reduce that by 100. One of the things we need to do, because we're using SQLite, is just make sure everything is in decimals. So this is now going to be giving me values between 0.31 and 3.14. That's probably a bit on the big side. So what I might do is just divide by 500. So that's going to give me values from 0.6 to 0.6. So that's not going to be too bad. And so if we now start to plot that, then you can now see, as I move through the space, I've got large spheres and small spheres depending on the size of the schools. So we can see we've got a quite large school here, Swanshurst, another large one here, Great Bar, but then quite a small school down here for dwellings, and I can even see there's one actually just buried right down on the bottom axis there. Final thing we're going to do is we're going to look at how we use lookup tables. So again, just go back to the mapping. Instead of having everybody as red, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up school type, and you can see here that has two values, whether it's a local authority school or an academy school. So I'm going to bring in that. But of course we can't plot that as colour directly, so what we've got to do is use a translation table. So click on the plus here, and I can tell it to autofill, and so what it's going to do, it's going to set school academy to red, and local default will explicitly make that blue, and there's a default value there as well. It's usually a good idea to set the default value to something like black, so it's fairly obvious where you've got a default value, and you can, if you want, manually add all these as well, but save that and plot the data again. So now we can see quite easily sort of which are the academy schools and which are the local authority schools. So Swanhurst, there's one of the local authority ones. Moseley School, one of the academy schools. Up here we've got the grammar schools, the King Edward schools. Again, those are all academy status. And finally, just to show that we can also control shape. So I've done my colour match, and I can go back and edit that if I want to. What I can do is do the same thing with shapes. In this case, I'm going to again choose school type. We often find it's quite useful to sort of reinforce a particular parameter by putting it on a couple of different attributes. Same thing here. So I'm going to tell it to autofill this. Not particularly sensible choices here, so what we're going to do is going to make this cube for schools and academies, and we're going to make it a sphere for local authorities, and again a fairly obvious shape for the default value. Click on that and click on plot. So here we have the data, and we have our local authority schools as blue spheres, and we have our academy schools as red cubes, and so we can now explore this data to our heart's content, and we'll put in the notes a link to a document that actually looked at this data set in quite a bit of detail. Just to finish off though, what we need to do is save this as a workspace so that we can come back to it later. So all I do is go up to the save workspace icon, click on that, give it a name, and click on OK, and it takes a little snapshot and saves that. And now if I actually clear this dataset totally, go back to an empty workspace, I can now go to open workspace, and here I can see the workspace I've just created, and if I want to I can give it a tag. So for instance I want to give this the tag of tutorial, and if I want to load that workspace, just click on it, click on load, and I'm back to the workspace we created. That's it for this tutorial. Hopefully it's given you a good idea about how you use Datascape to import data and get your first visualization, and we'll be doing lots more tutorials looking at the far more sophisticated features that we have within Datascape itself. Thank you.